December 20th, 1943. Eastern England. The air is sharp enough to sting lungs. Floodlights hang over wet concrete, turning puddles into pale mirrors. A B-17 warms itself awake, 4 engines pulsing in uneven rhythm, prop wash pushing fog into ribbons. Men climb into metal compartments, built for cold and noise, tightening straps with hands that already feel numb. Hours later, over Germany, the sky hardens into flak. Black bursts bloom around the formation, too close, too accurate, shaking rivets and nerves alike. One bomber slips out of its box position, wounded and falling behind. Smoke trails from a torn fuselage. A propeller slows. Inside, oxygen masks hiss, and the intercom is crowded with clipped urgency. Then a German fighter appears off the wing, close enough to see the pilot's head turn, guns aligned on a target that can barely fight back, and yet the firing doesn't come. By the winter of 1943, the air war over Europe had hardened into a daily test of endurance. For the United States Army Air Forces, the doctrine was clear and unforgiving: daylight precision bombing. Industrial targets would be destroyed from high altitude in tight formations, defended by overlapping fields of machine gun fire. The theory promised accuracy and mutual protection. The reality was attrition. From bases scattered across eastern England, the 8th Air Force launched hundreds of heavy bombers at a time. They flew long, predictable routes. They flew in daylight, and they flew into the most densely defended airspace on Earth. Germany had layered its defenses with radar warning, fighter control networks, and belts of anti-aircraft guns guarding cities, factories, and ports. Every mile closer to the target tightened the vice. On December 20th, 1943, one of those targets was Bremen. The city was a key industrial hub, producing aircraft components and naval equipment vital to the German war effort. Striking Bremen meant flying deep into northwestern Germany across known flak, concentrations, and along interception corridors the Luftwaffe understood intimately. It was not an experimental mission. It was a routine one, dangerous precisely because it followed patterns the enemy expected. Among the aircraft assigned that morning was a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress from the 379th Bomb Group, 527th Bomb Squadron. Its name, painted on the nose in casual script, was Ye Olde Pub. The crew was young by any standard of war. For several of them, this was their first combat mission. Formations were everything. Bombers were arranged in staggered boxes, each aircraft positioned to cover another's blind spots. To fall out of formation was to lose that protection. German fighter pilots were trained to watch for exactly that moment: the slight lag, the damaged wing, the struggling engine. A lone bomber was not a symbol of bravery or resilience. It was an opportunity. As the bomber stream crossed the German coast and pressed inland, flak batteries began to range the formations. Shells burst at altitude, calculated to explode where aircraft would be, not where they were. One direct hit was rarely required. Shrapnel severed control cables, punctured fuel tanks, shredded flesh. Damage accumulated quietly, relentlessly. By the time the formation neared Bremen, Ye Olde Pub was no longer just another aircraft in a vast skyborne machine. It was beginning to separate, slower, wounded, and increasingly visible. The B-17 Flying Fortress was designed around a single premise: survival through structure and firepower. With multiple engines, redundant systems, and up to 1350 caliber machine guns, it was meant to absorb punishment and keep flying. In formation, its defensive arcs overlapped with others, turning bomber boxes into moving fortresses of steel and tracers. Alone, that design advantage thinned rapidly. A B-17F at altitude depended on hydraulics to move control surfaces, oxygen systems to keep crews conscious, and engines that were vulnerable to a single fragment in the wrong place. When those systems failed, strength became weight. Altitude bled away. Speed followed. What remained was exposure. German air defense doctrine exploited this vulnerability with precision. Radar stations tracked incoming bomber streams and vectored fighter units ahead of them. Interceptors climbed fast, attacked hard, and disengaged before escort fighters, when present, could respond. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe knew it could not stop every bomber. Instead, it focused on killing as many as possible, especially those that lagged behind. Among the pilots scrambled that day was Franz Stiegler. He flew a Messerschmitt Bf 109G6, a single-seat fighter optimized for interception. Fast, heavily armed, and lethal in a short engagement, it was ideal for finishing damaged aircraft. Stiegler was not new to combat. He had already seen friends lost and cities burn. His training emphasized results. Victory was measured in destroyed enemy machines. Yet his training also carried older rules, inherited from an earlier generation of aviators. Instructors had spoken of honor in the air, of not firing on helpless crews, of recognizing when combat ceased to be a fight and became an execution. By 1943, those ideas were under pressure. Total war left little room for restraint. Pilots who hesitated risked court-martial, or worse. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the stakes were simpler and more immediate. Wounded men lay where they had fallen. Oxygen lines were damaged. Defensive guns were silent or unmanned. The aircraft struggled to maintain altitude, falling behind the main formation as it turned away from Bremen. When the last friendly bomber disappeared ahead into cloud and distance, the sky around Ye Olde Pub emptied. It was no longer part of a system. It was a single aircraft over enemy territory, moving slowly, trailing smoke, and waiting for what always came next. Human angle inside. Ye Olde Pub, the bomber no longer felt like a machine. It felt like a wounded body struggling to stay upright. The temperature at altitude was far below freezing, yet the smell inside the fuselage was hot metal, cordite, and smoke. Blood pooled where the floor dipped. A gunner lay mortally wounded, his position silent. Another crewman was injured, barely able to move. This was supposed to be a first mission, an introduction to combat. Instead, it became an abrupt lesson in isolation. Training had covered procedures, checklists, emergency drills. It had not prepared them for the psychological weight of being left behind. The intercom crackled with short, necessary exchanges. No one spoke more than needed. Oxygen was precious. Strength was limited. For the pilot, Second Lieutenant Charles Brown, the responsibility narrowed to one task: keep the aircraft flying. Not win, not fight. Survive long enough to reach water. Every control input had to be gentle. Any sudden movement risked tearing loose what little structure remained intact. Below them was enemy territory. Ahead, uncertainty. Fear was present, but it was compressed by necessity. There was no space for panic, only minutes and miles. Tactical angle. From a tactical perspective, Ye Olde Pub had become the ideal target. German fighter doctrine emphasized speed and efficiency. Damaged bombers were attacked from blind angles, often head-on or from the rear quarter, where defensive fire was weakest. A single fighter could destroy a straggler in seconds. The B-17's reputation for toughness depended on mutual defense. Alone, its guns covered wide arcs but lacked coordination. Missing gunners created gaps no armor could replace. Ammunition mattered less than angles. As the bomber limped away from Bremen, it crossed invisible lines on German plotting boards. It was marked. Fighters climbing below would see it clearly, slower, lower, and separated from protection. In the logic of the air war, the outcome was already decided. A lone bomber did not escape. It was intercepted, destroyed, and recorded as another number in a daily report. That logic held until it met a human being in the cockpit of an approaching fighter. Technological angle. The technology of the air war left little room for ambiguity. The B-17F Flying Fortress was engineered to fly straight and level under extreme stress, but only within limits. Ye Olde Pub was operating beyond them. One engine was destroyed, another was damaged. Hydraulic pressure was unreliable. Electrical systems flickered. The aircraft's altitude had dropped, placing it within easier reach of both fighters and flak. Opposite it was the Messerschmitt Bf-109G6. Built for interception, it climbed faster than any bomber could hope to escape. Its armament, 20mm cannon and machine guns, was designed to tear through aluminum skin and structural spars. Against a healthy formation, the Bf-109 relied on surprise and speed. Against a crippled bomber, it required only alignment and trigger pressure. The imbalance was absolute. One aircraft carried men trying to stay alive. The other carried a pilot trained to end them. Leadership, moral angle. When Franz Stigler closed the distance, he expected a routine intercept. What he saw instead forced a pause. The bomber's damage was unmistakable. Sections of fuselage were torn open. A tail gun that should have tracked him did not move. Through the holes in the aircraft, he could see wounded crewmen and blood-streaked metal. This was no longer combat in any practical sense. The bomber could not maneuver. It could barely defend itself. Finishing it would bring another victory mark, but it would also mean killing men who could not fight back. Stigler's training echoed sharply in that moment. His former commander had warned him that shooting a defenseless enemy was not heroism, it was murder. In the Luftwaffe of 1943, such hesitation carried risk. Pilots were expected to destroy enemy aircraft without exception. Mercy was not part of doctrine. Yet the sky allowed no oversight. No officer watched from above. Only one man, one decision, and one wounded bomber struggling toward the coast. Stigler did not fire. Instead, he maneuvered alongside the B-17, close enough to signal, close enough to be mistaken, by German gunners below for a friendly escort. In that narrow space, technology fell silent, and leadership took a form rarely recorded in combat reports. The aircraft continued westward, toward the sea, still alive, but not yet safe. The breaking point came just after the bomb run. Over Bremen, the flak intensified, thicker, tighter, walking through the formation with practiced precision. A burst struck Ye Olde Pub with catastrophic effect. Shrapnel ripped through the fuselage. One engine was knocked out completely. Another began to fail. Control cables were severed. The bomber lurched, dropped altitude, and slipped out of position. Inside, the damage became human. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckie Eckenrode, was mortally wounded. Other crewmen were injured, some unable to reach their stations. Oxygen lines were cut. At altitude, even a short delay meant unconsciousness. Brown fought to keep the aircraft level, nursing failing engines while the bomber fell farther behind the retreating formation. One by one, the other B-17s disappeared into cloud and distance. The protective geometry of the formation collapsed into empty sky. Below lay Germany. Ahead lay miles of hostile airspace. The bomber's defensive guns, once its signature, were now largely silent. German fighters arrived as expected. Several made passes, testing the bomber's defenses. Most broke away when they saw how badly it was damaged. They did not need to rush. A crippled aircraft could be finished at any time. Then one fighter stayed. Franz Stigler approached from behind and slightly below, positioning his Bf-109 for a killing burst. This was the angle taught in training. His guns were aligned. The bomber filled his windscreen. This distance, the outcome was certain. But as he closed in, details became impossible to ignore. The tail gun did not move. The fuselage was torn open. Through the gaps, he could see men tending to wounded crewmates. Blood streaked the interior skin. The aircraft was flying on borrowed moments. Stigler hesitated, not because of fear, but recognition. He later recalled that it reminded him of pilots he had seen parachuting from burning aircraft, men already beaten by circumstance. The logic of war pressed in from all sides. One burst would end it. The rules were clear, the expectation absolute. Instead, Stigler broke formation. He pulled alongside the bomber's wing, close enough that Brown could see the black crosses on the German fighter and the pilot's face beneath the canopy. The moment of decision had arrived, but its consequences were not yet finished. Flying wingtip to wingtip, the two aircraft held an uneasy formation. For Brown, the sight was terrifying. A German fighter, that close, could only mean one thing, until it didn't. No tracers crossed the gap. No cannon fire struck the fuselage. The fighters stayed with them, matching speed, matching altitude. Brown expected deception. He ordered his remaining gunners not to fire. Any hostile move might provoke the burst that would tear the bomber apart. Inside the cockpit, every second stretched. The engines vibrated unevenly. Control inputs remained shallow and cautious. Below them, the German flak belts waited. Anti-aircraft gunners were trained to fire on enemy bombers crossing back toward the coast. But the presence of a Luftwaffe fighter flying in close escort created uncertainty. Firing risked hitting one of their own. The bomber passed through this zone without drawing the usual curtain of steel. Stigler held his position deliberately. He gestured toward the north, indicating a heading that would shorten the bomber's exposure. He did not speak. He could not. The message was carried by proximity, alone. The coastline appeared ahead, a thin gray line separating land from water. For German interceptors, this boundary mattered. Pursuit beyond it invited fuel risk and interception by Allied fighters. Stigler stayed with the bomber until it reached that edge. There, he made a final choice. He slid his fighter out to the side, came up level with the cockpit, and rendered a brief salute. It was not a symbol of friendship. It was an acknowledgement of survival. Then he rolled away, banking back toward Germany, leaving the bomber alone again, this time over open water. The danger was not over. The North Sea was unforgiving. Cold, wind, and failing engines claimed crews as efficiently as flak. But now there was distance. Now there was time. Ye Olde Pub staggered onward, losing altitude slowly, Brown adjusting power with care. The crew tended to wounds, redistributed weight, and waited for the English coast to emerge from haze. Hours after takeoff, the bomber crossed back into Allied airspace. It landed hard but intact at RAF Seething. Ground crews stared at the aircraft in disbelief. Entire sections were missing. Holes peppered the fuselage. The fact that it had returned at all seemed improbable. In the debriefing room, Brown faced an unexpected dilemma. Reporting the encounter risked accusations of hallucination or worse. Yet he recorded it as accurately as he could. A German fighter that had every reason to kill them, and chose not to. The war continued the next day. Bombers flew, fighters intercepted. Most encounters ended as expected. This one did not, and its meaning would take decades to fully emerge. The return flight across the North Sea was quiet in a way combat never was. There were no enemy aircraft, no flak bursts, no sudden evasive turns. Only engine noise, wind, and the constant calculation of whether the bomber could remain airborne a few minutes longer. Brown kept the aircraft just above stall speed, aware that any loss of lift could send them into the water. Inside the fuselage, the crew worked in silence. Wounded men were stabilized as best they could. Blankets were wrapped around bodies already slipping into shock. The dead remained where they had fallen. There was no space, no strength, and no reason to move them. When the English coastline finally appeared, it felt distant rather than triumphant. The aircraft was too damaged to celebrate survival yet. Brown lined up for landing at RAF Seething with extreme caution. The landing gear responded slowly. The bomber touched down hard, shuddering across the runway before coming to rest. Ground crews ran toward the aircraft, stopping short when they saw the extent of the damage. Entire sections of the fuselage were torn open. Hundreds of holes marked the skin. One engine hung useless, another barely turned. The fact that the aircraft had crossed Germany, reached the sea, and returned was difficult to reconcile with its condition. Medical teams removed the wounded immediately. Sergeant Eckenrode was pronounced dead. Others survived with injuries that would end their combat tours. Ye Olde Pub was judged unfit for further missions and removed from frontline service. In the debriefing room, Brown described the mission in measured detail. Flak damage, fighter attacks, the escort, the German pilot who did not fire. The intelligence officers listened without interruption. There were no follow-up questions, no commentary. The report was filed and quietly set aside. In wartime, events that do not fit doctrine are often left unexplored. The 8th Air Force had lost dozens of bombers that day. One aircraft surviving, no matter how unusual the reason, did not alter the operational picture. Yet for the men who had been inside Ye Olde Pub, the encounter did not end on the runway. It followed them into every mission that came after, carrying the weight of a moment when survival depended not on armor or firepower, but on restraint. For Charles Brown, the war continued. He completed his combat tour and returned home carrying memories that did not fit easily into victory narratives. The story of the German fighter stayed largely private. In the culture of wartime reporting, mercy by an enemy pilot was an uncomfortable anomaly, something to acknowledge but not emphasize. Franz Stigler also continued flying. His decision that day remained unrecorded in official German reports. Admitting to sparing an enemy aircraft could have led to severe punishment. Silence was not a moral choice. It was survival. When the war ended, Stigler left Germany and eventually emigrated to Canada, carrying the memory with him and assuming it would remain unresolved. Decades passed before the two men would learn each other's names. In the late 1980s, Brown began searching for the pilot who had escorted his bomber. Through veteran networks and historical organizations, he made his story public, hoping the German pilot might still be alive. The search succeeded. In 1990, Brown and Stigler finally met. Stigler confirmed the encounter without embellishment. He explained that he could not bring himself to fire on a crew that was already beaten. Years later, he summarized his reasoning simply. He had seen men trying to stay alive, not enemies trying to win. The two men remained in contact for the rest of their lives. Their relationship was not built on shared ideology or reconciliation ceremonies. It was built on mutual recognition of a moment that stood outside the machinery of war. Historians would later note the rarity of such encounters. Thousands of bombers were destroyed over Europe. Intercepts were designed to be brief and lethal. Mercy was neither rewarded nor expected. That is what gives this incident its weight. It did not change the course of the air war. It did not reduce casualties. It did not rewrite strategy. What it preserved was something smaller and more fragile. Evidence that even in a system designed for destruction, individual choice could still interrupt the expected outcome, briefly, quietly, and at great personal risk. High-altitude warfare in the Second World War reduced human beings to silhouettes behind glass and aluminum. Targets were identified by speed, altitude, and position. Success was measured in aircraft destroyed, not lives spared. The system worked because it discouraged hesitation, yet systems are operated by people. The encounter between Ye Olde Pub and Franz Stigler's fighter did not alter doctrine or strategy. Bombing campaigns continued. Interceptors kept firing. Loss rates remained brutal. Technology continued to advance toward efficiency, not mercy. What changed, if only for a moment, was the boundary of choice. In a sky governed by orders and expectations, one pilot recognized defenselessness and acted against momentum. The decision carried no reward and significant risk. It survived only because it was not recorded at the time. In studying warfare, such moments are often dismissed as anomalies. They do not scale, they do not replicate, but they matter because they reveal what war cannot fully erase. Aircraft are machines, weapons are tools, but restraint is human. Over the North Sea in December 1943, two aircraft separated. One turned back to Germany, the other limped toward home. Between them hung a decision that would outlast the mission, the war, and the men themselves. It remains not as a lesson in how wars are won, but as a reminder of what they test and what they sometimes leave intact. High above Europe, the Second World War was fought by instruments designed to remove distance and doubt. Altitude flattened landscapes into maps. Speed compressed decisions into seconds. At that height, war became procedural. Targets were approached, attacked, recorded, and left behind. The encounter between Ye Olde Pub and Franz Stigler did not disrupt that system. The bombing campaign continued. Interceptors kept rising to meet the bomber streams. Thousands of aircraft were still lost before the war ended. Nothing about December 20th, 1943, softened the mechanics of total war. What it revealed was something else. Technology can dictate outcomes, but it cannot fully dictate judgment. Even in an environment built to eliminate hesitation, a human being can still recognize when victory has already been decided. In that narrow space between capability and choice, restraint briefly entered a war that rarely allowed it. This was not mercy that ended a conflict, nor compassion that rewrote strategy. It was a single decision made without witnesses, without reward, and without protection. It survived only because the men involved lived long enough to tell it. History often remembers wars through numbers: sorties flown, aircraft lost, cities destroyed. But occasionally, it preserves a moment that resists calculation. Two aircraft parted over cold water. One carried men who would live. The other carried a pilot who accepted silence as the price of his choice. In a war defined by destruction, that decision did not change history, but it endured within it.